and some brief words to present our invited speaker. Martin Puchner is the Byron and Anita Green Professor of Drama and of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And he is the author of The Drama of Ideas, Platonic Provocations in Theatre and Philosophy, published in Oxford University Press, I guess. Poetry and Revolution, Marx, Manifestos and the Avant-Garde, Princeton. Stage Fright, Modernism Theatrically and in Drama, Hopkins, as well as of numerous edited volumes and source books, including Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, The Communist Manifesto and other writings. He is the general editor of Northern Anthology of World Literature, already the third edition, and he also writes on literature, drama and politics for the London Review of Books, Raritan Bokfuren, number 27 and Inside Higher Ed. Thank you very much for your presence. Please get the stage.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Paulo Montero and the organizing committee. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a privilege to start this conference, and I think it's a pleasure because this theme of the conference, theater and philosophy, or drama and philosophy, is something that has been on my mind ever since I was a philosophy major in college, during which time I also did a lot of theater. And it so happened that the Black Box Theater, where we did a lot of student theater, was directly underneath the auditorium, in the space left by the auditorium, where during the day we listened to philosophy lectures. And for everyone in this room, this setup will immediately conjure the Platonic cave where philosophy happens. Upstairs, daylight, you see the sun, and so on and so forth. And downstairs in the cave, the Black Box Theater, is where theater happens. And I think ever since I've been trying to figure out whether that's the appropriate architectural and theoretical constellation. So this interest in theater and philosophy has led me to a longer research project that ended in a recent book called The Drama of Ideas, where I indeed took Plato as a point of departure for thinking about theater and philosophy. Because Plato, of course, is responsible for what's sometimes called the anti-theatrical prejudice in philosophy, or what perhaps I would like to describe as a kind of recurring critique of the theater and philosophy. But also because Plato, as we all know, not only was intensely interested in the theater, as is testified to in such moments as the cave, the theatrical cave, but also because he wrote in the dramatic form of the philosophical dialogue. And so I used Plato as a point of departure, as I said, both for thinking about philosophers interested in the theater, like Nietzsche and so on and so forth, all the way to Alain Badiou, Iris Murdoch, and Alain Badiou. I noticed someone is going to talk about Iris Murdoch, but also for a kind of history of drama that's interested in philosophy and ideas. So was sort of my bigger attempt to answer this question: what is the relationship between theater and philosophy? But as often happens there, I felt that there was some unfinished business left, and this is what I want to talk about today, namely focus on what is arguably the most important strain within 20th century, certainly philosophy, but thought more generally. And after hearing the introductions, it seems like I'm in the right place here, namely the philosophy of language. So the main object of the talk today is to think about dramatic, but actually not just dramatic, responses to Ludwig Wittgenstein, clearly the central figure in language philosophy. But before I talk about these various, what I call dramatic heirs, that is, writers, dramatists, so novelists and poets to some extent, who responded to Wittgenstein and integrated his language philosophy in their work. So a good example of philosophy and drama. Before I give you a kind of panorama of their work, and some figures I'm sure will be familiar, others perhaps less so, I want to pause for a second and think about the stakes, the intellectual stakes of this project. And put in the most general terms, I would say that it has to do with the fate of language philosophy. With some exaggeration, it could be said that the 20th century was the century of language philosophy. Language, if we look to the beginning of the century, or the beginning of the 20th century, was the cause of greatest despair, leading some writers and philosophers to talk about a crisis, or crisis of language. But also the cause of greatest promise, almost utopian promise. Figures like Rudolf Carnap and his project of a kind of logical reconstruction of language. Now, people couldn't agree about whether language needed to be reformed, something that George Bernard Shaw and many others advocated, or purified, like Karl Kraus wanted to, and how it should be studied. But even though they couldn't agree on what their take on language was, they all agreed pretty much that language was the key, that the path to knowledge led through language. Now, if it's legitimate to say that the 20th century was the host of something you might call the drama of language, how it should be studied, and everything, Wittgenstein was its drama queen. He contributed several of the most important theories of language, with various self-appointed heirs fighting over his corpse. But I think despite Wittgenstein's influence, perhaps even his growing or at least more widespread influence now, I think it's fair to say that the drama of language seems to me plays increasingly to smaller houses. And I noticed that this contraction with some regret, that this drama of language is what drew me first into academia as a philosophy major and then in my subsequent work. And the appeal of language was simply that it somehow promised to explain the world. That's at least how it seemed to me. And that in order to understand language, you needed to study some combination of language philosophy and literature, which precisely is what I did. Now, my problem is, and I think it's not just my problem, is that I no longer quite believe that language is the path to knowledge. And I think there's something in our current intellectual moment that has displaced the importance of the language of a philosophy of language from the center of intellectual energy, let's say. It used to be that other disciplines looked to language philosophy and those who studied language for inspiration. And I think, again, this is very general, and I'd like some pushback from you if you don't agree. It seems to me that that we now look to other disciplines, sociology, economics, to understanding the world. And this is very crude and very schematic, but this is sort of what's in the back of my mind, and that's why I wanted to say this as a kind of framing of what the ultimate stakes are for this meditation on language philosophy, and dramatic and literary responses to it. So even though this is a kind of melancholy story, at least for me, that I'm telling, I think there's a silver lining, and the silver lining is composed of these literary and dramatic heirs of Wittgenstein. When I contemplate their work, and it starts in the 50s and 60s, but culminates in the 80s and 90s, I sometimes think of these literary heirs of Wittgenstein as exemplifying a kind of last flowering of this language century, a final, almost extravagant celebration of the powers and mysteries of language, an homage to the time when language ruled the world, in part because I think they were incredibly smart and perceptive about language, these literary heirs of Wittgenstein's. They noticed things about Wittgenstein's language philosophy that many philosophers didn't easily notice. And they also continued, and this is something I want to emphasize, Wittgenstein's own struggle and work with writing philosophy, with different genres and modes of writing, really something that's really central to Wittgenstein. So this explains perhaps also this emphasis on writing, why Wittgenstein had literary heirs in the first place. Now, I'm sure many people here have come across the famous claim Wittgenstein made with respect to the Tractatus, namely that this work, the Tractatus, is entirely philosophical but also entirely literary at the same time. Now this claim is a good place to start thinking about the relation between Wittgenstein and literature, and hence about these literary heirs, though I want to also start with a word of caution, since that sentence, that the Tractatus is both philosophical and literary at the same time, comes from a letter Wittgenstein wrote to his publisher when he was pretty desperate to get his work published. And he wrote to the editor of a literary journal trying to pitch his work as being literary as well as philosophical, when perhaps in truth it was in some strange way neither, or another way to describe this is to say that it was Wittgensteinian. In any case, there's some caution we have to exercise when it comes to literature and philosophy, and I think both for this conference as a whole and certainly for my talk, I want to say that in thinking about the relationship, it's not a matter of trying to level the distinction between literature and philosophy. I think in some sense we need to highlight the distinction and then look at the various interactions and intersections. So among these literary heirs of Wittgenstein, there were many who were primarily struck by Wittgenstein's own struggle with the form and style of writing, and who were inspired to continue the struggle with their own literary projects. So by approaching Wittgenstein through his style, they also called attention to this, if you will, stylistic or literary dimension of his philosophy. So who are they, these literary heirs? Let me present some of them to you. Now, perhaps unsurprising, given that Wittgenstein spent most of his time in Austria and England, the earliest responses to Wittgenstein came from Oxbridge and Vienna. So, first one I want to talk about briefly is Iris Murdoch, and I think we're going to hear more about her later today, whose own work, of course, straddles literature, drama, and philosophy. And she too was very insistent that she didn't want to merge the relation between the two. Her most notable and most interesting, I think, response to Wittgenstein is her novel Under the Net from 1955, written only a few years after Wittgenstein's death. Now, Under the Net approaches Wittgenstein from the perspective of an observer narrator named Jake. And Jake reports to us throughout the novel about his acquaintance with a character named Hugo, son of a rich German Jewish weapons manufacturer who lives a Spartan life in England and is a mesmerizing interlocutor. Slightly more radical in this respect than Wittgenstein himself, Hugo refuses to write at all, insisting on natural spoken dialogue as the only form of expression. And his philosophy is radically anti-metaphysical, mostly intent on falsifying the statements of others. And faced with this brilliant talker, our narrator, Jake, begins to write down the conversations he's had with Hugo, polishes them, and finally ends up publishing them without telling Hugo, to notable success. So, but he doesn't tell Hugo about it. Unable to face his philosophical friend after this betrayal, that is, after publishing in an unauthorized manner these dialogues, he breaks off the friendship with him, only to find out much later that Hugo actually never even recognized these published and written dialogues as his own, because they seem so different to his mind from what he actually said and from the medium of live speech. So the Socratic echoes here are very obvious. And in fact, Iris Murdoch would go on to try her own hand at the Socratic dialogue, the form of the Socratic dialogue in a work called Akastos, which consists of two dialogues revolving around Socrates and his friends, who are discussing, perhaps anachronistically, mostly 20th century problems of aesthetics and ethics. Now, Under the Net, the novel I've been talking about, is quite conventional in form. What's interesting about it is that it's fascinated with this form of the dialogue. Now, the narrator's project, though, keeps the dialogue also at a distance, because Iris Murdoch knows better than to try to render these mesmerizing dialogues in her own novel. So she keeps a certain distance. The novel is really a kind of narrative novel without giving us the dialogue, keeping these dialogues at a distance. The novel talks about them, talks about the effects of them, but doesn't give them to us directly. So one could say that Murdoch approaches Wittgenstein from two angles. First, she presents him as a figure with all the attributes that contributed to turning Wittgenstein into this kind of mystique and charismatic figure, the effects on his associates, with many of his friends and associates reported, kind of larger-than-life figure. The rich foreign provenance, the quasi-saintly austerity of his life, his mesmerizing effect on others. But the sex, so that's important, and we will return to that trope of presenting Wittgenstein as a figure, the fascination of him as a personal figure. But the second is generic. Wittgenstein is presented as someone struggling with and against the written word, a figure existing in spoken discourse that cannot be captured by a kind of latter-day Plato who hopes to take down Socrates' conversations. Instead, we have the relatively traditional form of an observer-narrator, observing the drama of Wittgenstein and his struggle with expression, I might say, from the safe distance afforded to him, to this narrator, by the established form of the novel. So this is all I'm going to say about Iris Murdoch, and rush on to the next early response to Wittgenstein, which is also novelistic, namely by Thomas Bernhard in his novel Korrektur from 1975. So this is 20 years later. We're moving quite fast. Now, unsurprisingly, perhaps Bernhard looks at Wittgenstein, who is more thinly disguised than Hugo in Murdoch's novel, that is closer to the historical Wittgenstein, from Austria. So this is Bernhard's point of view. Ludwig Reuthammer, the Wittgenstein character in his novel, is the son of a rich Austrian family, and he went to Cambridge to become a famous scientist, but also, though to a second degree, a philosopher, and then returns to Austria to build a house for his sister. As we know, this is what Wittgenstein did. There's much more emphasis on Ludwig Reuthammer's family background, including a history of suicide in his family, as well as on Ludwig Reuthammer's attempt to extricate himself from this extended and established family. Again, we witness this through an observer-narrator, so the same generic technique as Murdoch employed. Or rather, we don't quite witness it because the novel begins, when the novel begins, Ludwig Reuthammer has just hanged himself. And the narrator, our narrator, is going through his literary estate, whose executor he has become. Wittgenstein is left with a large amount of fragments, written fragments, but only fragments. Originally, in the beginning, our narrator is trying to get some order into these fragments and hopes to publish them, but pretty soon it becomes clear that he will not succeed, and that this is a hopeless enterprise. It's clearly something Thomas Bernhard loves, hopeless enterprises. Ludwig Reuthammer has left only fragments because he's an obsessive perfectionist, and that's another, for those of you who know Thomas Bernhard, another type that fascinates him. For example, the house that he's built for his sister is in the shape of a perfect cone, erected in the middle of a large forest. The house is the product of a perfectionistic obsession, and in fact drives his sister mad, and the implication is himself, Ludwig Reuhammer, to suicide. Now, in this novel, Bernhard clearly seeks to capture something about the figure of Wittgenstein, again, his obsessive perfectionism, his estranged relationship to Austria, his family entanglements, and the way he materialized his approach to thinking, and in particular to mathematics, by designing a building, an architectural building. But like Murdoch, I think Bernhard does more than that, more than just dwell on this sort of cultural figure of Wittgenstein. He also engages Wittgenstein on the level of language. Korrektur is written in a distinct style that I would call comparative. The narrator constantly and obsessively and, in a sense, annoyingly compares himself to Ludwig Reuhammer in cascades of sentences that go like this. Ludwig was like this, I was like that. Ludwig did this, I did that, and so on and so forth. In every page there are many such comparisons. In this way, Bernhard tries to distill the relationship between the observer, narrator, and this absent Wittgensteinian protagonist. But these comparisons are not only a way to solve, or rather force into the forefront of our reading experience, this narrative perspective, the distance between the narrator and this Ludwig character. Comparisons, we learn, are also at the heart of Ludwig's philosophy. The narrator quotes it, quote, "We must always have the possibility of comparison. Without the possibility of comparison, we cannot think, cannot act, nothing," said Reuhammer. End of quote. This sentence also captures, as an aside, a second kind of stylistic tick or strategy, namely reported speech. Again, and this becomes annoying, though in an interesting way, almost each sentence contains this reminder that we are reading reported speech, and sometimes there are 2, even 3 layers of sentences that then end with said Reuhammer, said I, said he. So there are these kind of layers of reported speech. But as I said, more important for me in terms of the engagement, Bernhard's engagement with Wittgenstein, is this matter of comparison. As we know, Ludwig Wittgenstein's actual philosophy, not just the fragments left behind by the character in this novel, is very centrally concerned with comparisons, with the importance of comparison for philosophy, though Wittgenstein also cautioned against comparison. I can talk more about this perhaps in the Q&A. So I think in his own way, Bernhard continues both Wittgenstein's perfectionism and his reliance on comparison in his own philosophy. That's, I think, the heart of his engagement with the substance, if you will, of Wittgenstein's thought. But I think Bernhard's novel can also be understood as a kind of cautionary tale. Wittgenstein was interested in comparison, as I said, in holding different cases next to each other, different examples side by side. But he was even more worried about the dangers, the seduction almost, of comparison. And he always asked his listeners and readers to think about the grounds of comparison, the pointing to differences, moments when comparisons break down. In Bernhard's novel, by contrast, comparisons are completely out of control. They dominate. They have completely taken over the thinking and the style of the novel. So I think Bernhard is, in a sense, one could say, describing what happens when comparisons are out of control and have taken over someone's thinking. So let me just pause for a second and take stock. We have 2 novelistic approaches to Wittgenstein. They combine an engagement with Wittgenstein as a figure with an, I think, approach to the substance of his language philosophy. In Murdoch's case, primarily through this generic negotiation between novel and the dialogue that revolves around this problem of live speech and how to record it. And in Bernhard's case, through this distinct style based on comparisons. So, still going chronologically, I want to rush on to a third early response, this one from 1979, and here we have also finally arrived at drama proper, namely Tom Stoppart's play Dogs, Hamlet, from 1979, which is a few years after Thomas Bernhardt's novel. And this move from the novel to drama is, I think, significant and, of course, of interest here. I should add that Thomas Bernhardt himself undertook such a move. He wrote a second Wittgenstein novel that I think is somewhat less interesting than the one I've been talking about, Korrektur, called Wittgenstein's Nephew. But also, he wrote a play called Ritter dene Faust, which revolves again about a Wittgenstein character and is, dramatically speaking, quite interesting. The question is, for us, what happens in this shift that I'm about to make between novelistic responses and dramatic responses? What does drama have to say about Wittgenstein, to put it differently? Murdoch might give us a first hint. I have said that from the distance afforded to her by the form of the novel, Murdoch could observe in Wittgenstein a struggle with how to write dialogue, the elusive project of writing down speech. But the safe distance could also be seen as a kind of retreat. Murdoch didn't want to take up the challenge of philosophical dialogue directly. And in fact, as I said, when she did in these dialogues in Akastos, wasn't particularly successful, I think. What happens when dramatists get into the Wittgenstein game? I think Stoppart is the most interesting of these dramatic responses, so let me talk about him a little bit. Stoppart's fullest engagement with Wittgenstein occurs in this play called Dogs, Hamlet. It's a short play, and what's interesting about it, the way it's a direct response to Wittgenstein, is that it's based on a scene that comes early on in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. In the scene, Wittgenstein presents two characters called A and B in a setting furnished with various building materials that lie around in piles. And the chief action of this little scene concerns the relation between the action of these two characters and the words they use. A asks B a number of questions to which he then provides the answers. And the questions concern the various kind of building materials, cubes and blocks that are lying around. A initially asks B about the number of elements in each pile, but Wittgenstein uses this scene to kind of think about how we acquire language. More and more, he's interested in the theatrical enactment of the scene. The key moment in these reflections is when Wittgenstein says, quote, "Well, what makes a difference is the manner in which one speaks the words in this language game with the cubes and the blocks. But in addition, the tone in which they are spoken will be different, as well as the facial expression and other factors." So Wittgenstein here, characteristically very tuned to not only what these characters say about the cubes and so on and so forth, but how they say it, facial expressions, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot in this little mini scene that deserves analysis, including that Wittgenstein examines speech acts, as we could now call them, as well as an ever-increasing number of factors, the enunciation of these words, the tone, facial expression. But what I want to focus on is the scene itself, namely the fact that Wittgenstein, in his late philosophy, invents many of these mini scenes that are used almost as dramatic experiments for the purposes of testing different hypotheses. And that's how Wittgenstein uses them. He keeps coming back to this scene and runs different kind of hypotheses and versions of the scene almost as a kind of test. So there's the dimension of character then. So what are the contours of these Wittgensteinian mini scenes? There's the dimension of character. As I said, he invents characters in these scenes, here called A and B, but it's of course clear that that we know very little about these characters, and we need to know very little about these characters. He's not interested in their interiority, in their inner processes, and that's in keeping with his approach, namely that he doesn't want to explain different language uses through reference to inner processes. Language needs to be explained through an emphasis on acts, on internal behavior, not form of interiority. There's a dimension of scene, which is, of course, an eminently dramatic category, which here is extremely spare, furnished only with a few props. These props are central, and these props activate the scenario and are used in the central question that the scenario is supposed to answer. So, characters, scenes, mini-dramas, one could say, all over Wittgenstein's work. And this is precisely the reason why a dramatist like Tom Stoppard would become interested in Wittgenstein. So, Stoppard takes this setup, this scenario, and then modifies it. As he says, Tom Stoppard does, in his introduction to Dog's Hamlet, he was drawn to this material and ended up using it in order to write a, quote, play which had to teach the audience the language the play was written in. What would happen, and of course, what would happen, Stoppard asks, if the central terms of the play, planks, slabs, cubes, these building materials with which Wittgenstein starts, with which Stoppard starts, didn't actually have the meaning they have in English, but instead denoted respectively ready, okay, next, and thank you. Stoppard promptly proceeds to play out this scenario. And this is how it works. Even though it looks like A is calling for the different objects B throws him as they're building something on the stage, no such command is given. Actually, the two workers know exactly what they're doing. They don't have to communicate about this working process, the action they are engaged in. Instead, they're engaging in everyday chit-chat. Chit-chat using these words that actually mean something else. So, while Wittgenstein here is interested in the scene in how we use words and how words relate to objects, Stoppard is interested in something else, namely this discrepancy between words and practice. He confronts different misunderstandings about the relationship between words and objects and words and practice. Dog's Hamlet, this play starts with a different game, actually, also related to an interest of Wittgenstein's, namely a ball game. It's with this ball game that Stoppard starts to actually try to teach the audience this new language, the new language the play is written in. So the way this works is that Stoppard introduces the audience to different scenarios, like the ball game or like a lunch break, where characters use the different words in the play in this coded language. But pretty quickly, we as the audience can figure out what these words mean. Why? Because we finally understand the practice they're embedded in, right? So for example, during the lunch break, the characters exchange sandwiches, and we see the sandwiches, and we learn the language they use in order to communicate about this language. Or for example, in the ball game, we understand the language in which this play is written. But then, of course, Wittgenstein, Stoppard would not be Stoppard if he didn't introduce a problem into the scenario. And this problem comes in the form of a lorry driver who speaks English. And then mayhem ensues because the lorry driver doesn't understand that the two characters use English words, but that they have completely different meanings. So then a collision of languages happens, and this is also an occasion for a lot of comment. Now, for good measure, Stoppard also introduces a meta-theatrical dimension, because it turns out over the course of the play that the builders use these cubes and slabs and so on and so forth to build a stage on which Hamlet will be performed by the end of the play, a short version of Hamlet, and Hamlet, thank God, is going to be performed in English. So we learn this coded language, and then finally the play culminates with Shakespeare in English. So how is this approach really, what kind of consequences does this play have for Wittgenstein? The best way of answering this, I think, is to ask, how do we learn the language of this play, Dog? At first blush, it seems like Augustine would offer the best explanation, and Augustine is also how Wittgenstein opens the philosophical investigation. We observe how different characters use words by looking at the objects they handle, right? Sandwiches, the ball, and so on and so forth. But this Augustinian explanation doesn't really work, I would say, because dog is not a proper language at all. It doesn't have a grammar that's independent from English, and in all other ways is completely parasitic on English. It's just a coded version of English. It's not a new language. So, in fact, I think, only understand dog so quickly in the play because we are embedded in a language practice that we have learned in a very different way, in a way that Wittgenstein, I think, explains the best. So it looks like Stoppard actually uses St. Augustine, and that therefore this would be kind of a critique of Wittgenstein, anti-Augustinian stance, but I think in the end is actually not, because this is just a coded version of English. So an interesting engagement, I would say, with this dimension of Wittgenstein's thought. I think there's a larger lesson to be learned here about Wittgenstein's approach to language, and I think Stoppard's play really calls attention to that, and that is more generally this kind of dramatic dimension of Wittgenstein's late philosophy. And one could even start with the word language game, what's usually translated into English as language, the word language game itself. The German word it's based on is Sprachspiel. The important thing about that is that in German there's no distinction between game and play. Both terms are expressed with the word Spiel. Now, what's lost in the standard translation of Sprachspiel into language game is it's a contraction. It's an emphasis, and that's important for Wittgenstein's philosophy, on rule-governed activities, and rule following is crucial for Wittgenstein's late philosophy. Chess is an important example that he uses again and again for this kind of rule-governed dimension of language. But there is another dimension, and that is denoted also by the word Spiel, and that should be translated as play. Early on in the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein lists a whole range of examples of Sprachspiel, what he means as Sprachspiel, and among them is playing theater. Now, playing theater, I think, cannot be captured with this conventional translation of language game, the emphasis, as the English word game suggested, on rule governing. But I think has this larger, and here I would say dramatic dimension of playing theater, playing roles, and also in Wittgenstein's case, of writing philosophy in a quasi-dramatic form by inventing these different kind of mini language games or scenarios of which his late philosophy is crucially composed. So that's the kind of dramatic dimension of Wittgenstein, and I think a dimension that's highlighted when a playwright such as Stoppard gets his hands on Wittgenstein and really highlights this kind of dramatic dimension. So, 1979, Tom Stoppard's Dog's Hamlet, the last of this kind of early responses to Wittgenstein, and I want to now rush on to a second group and talk about them only very briefly. A group of Wittgenstein's heirs writing in the 1980s and 90s, which curiously enough turns out to be the high watermark of these literary responses to Wittgenstein. If one just looks numerically, there are a few early ones, including the ones I've mentioned, and then there's an explosion, really, a kind of increase, radical increase in literary responses to Wittgenstein. And I have some suggestions about why that is in the 80s and 90s. Two things are interesting about the second wave, if you will, of responses. First, that they are not from either Austria or England, the way these earlier ones were, but from North America. And they are not primarily novelistic or dramatic. Many of these later literary heirs are poets. This is something rather new. We still have novels, including one of the great contemporary American writers, David Foster Wallace, whose first novel, The Groom of the System from '87, is a Wittgenstein novel. It revolves around a grandmother who's absent from the novel, who's a radical Wittgensteinian, and becomes kind of the central figure of this novel. And a second novel from '87 by David Markson called Wittgenstein's Mistress, which is a very experimental novel that's interesting and that I could talk about at great length. But generally speaking, it's no longer novelists and dramatists who are at the forefront of these Wittgenstein responses. It's poets. And let me just conclude by talking about very few of them. And probably you will not have heard of them. And I want to introduce you to them here. One is called Jan Zwicky, and he wrote a little booklet in 1986 called Wittgenstein Elegies. It's a short book of poetry written under the direct influence of the philosopher. Wittgenstein Elegies sound central themes of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, both early and late, and that's another pattern. Many of these later responses combine the early work and the late work of Wittgenstein in interesting ways. For example, Jan Zwicky uses phrases like that are well known and you'll all recognize: the world is all that is the case, or he echoes particular thoughts. Words show us everything, as an example. But recasting thoughts to be found in Wittgenstein's writing is not the primary point here. Jan Zwicky also often expands on Wittgenstein's metaphors, as for example in this line. To see is to be unafraid to cast away the ladder we have cherished. Or, our language is an ancient city, maze of interlocking streets and squares. To know it, we must walk it, crawl through sewers, feel our way by night along the walls. Most answers squat before us humbler questions. So this is the kind of sound of these elegies. These works use a reservoir of words and expressions and terms that are crucial to Wittgenstein. Object, world, logic, sign, hidden, representation. And when reading through these elegies, one remembers Wittgenstein's texts, finds echoes, extensions, reflections. A poet responding to Wittgenstein, the writer. To be sure, the fascination with Wittgenstein's person is not entirely gone. In fact, by the 80s, Wittgenstein has become this kind of cultural icon. So Zwicky also writes, quote, wealth clutters, opulence breeds death, or work in philosophy is work upon oneself, slow chip and erasure. But these biographical concerns, as we might call them, are directly related to language, how we choose and place words, how to pare them down, how the work on language is the central occupation that Zwicky shares with Wittgenstein. Next one I want to introduce is a poet named Rosemary Waldrop, whose central work is Reproduction of Profiles, is the title. Also from '87, these are all published in the same year. A short book of prose poems in the tradition of Mallarmé. Like Zwicky, Waldrop extends, in some cases adds to Wittgenstein's metaphor. Just to give you another example, quote, visibility was poor, the field limited by grammatical rules, the foghorns of language. Let me say that again. Visibility was poor, the field limited by grammatical rules, comma, the foghorns of language. Her main strategies to take Wittgenstein's own questions: is a picture of the world real? What is a name? When is a picture like a ruler you hold to reality? and to gently bend them in different directions. Quote, "The proportion of accident in my picture of the world falls with the rain." Or, "Truth can be strenuous. It makes you lean against the window frame." And throughout these examples, there's language culled from the Tractatus and personalized. That's an important twist she adds. First, these prose poems are addressed, as much of Wittgenstein's later work is, to another person, a you. This way, the prose poems take on the flavor of a conversation. And this echoes, of course, this whole concern with dialogue. And for example, "Everything that can be thought at all, you said, can be thought over." Or, "So I agreed, you said, that there were languages to be admired rather than understood." Sometimes we even have outright dialogue. Quote, "If I could only accept similes," you began, "but I interrupted with a question about your body of doctrine. That, you said, would take rhythm and logic in afternoon rotation." So what we have here is prose poems that select terms and thoughts from the Tractatus and bend them in the direction of everyday life, turn them into dialogue, interweave the later and the earlier work of Wittgenstein. I think I should come to a conclusion, I want to end with one more work, a final heir of Wittgenstein's, not primarily a literary nor dramatic one, namely the Hungarian filmmaker Peter Forgách. In the early 90s, so we're still in that sort of central piece of moment of flowering, he created a film called Wittgenstein's Tractatus. It was actually the first Wittgenstein-inspired work I came across shortly after it came out in the early 90s. Just kind of stayed with me, I think, and lingered in my mind, prompting me finally to understand this and to undertake this project. So this film consists of 3 layers of moving images, and I'm going to conclude by showing you a brief clip of images, sound, and text written across the street. The images are mostly home videos from the first half of the 20th century. Hungarians, mostly Super 8 films. Hungarians filming each other, sometimes performing for the camera, doing a little dance, or else there's a wedding or a party, children playing, people at a beach. On occasion, a still image is presented over which someone has been drawing, for example, circling a face, or drawing a diagram with numbers. There are also more ominous images of men in uniforms, airplanes, German shepherds, trains. It's clear that this private world of these home videos is somehow being threatened. And then there's a consistent humming. Someone is humming a single melody throughout the film. Finally, there's the Tractatus. There's a voice that reads with a Hungarian accent passages from the Tractatus, interspersed with quotes from the so-called secret diaries written during Wittgenstein's secret diaries written during World War I, in which Wittgenstein talks about everything that he didn't want to talk about in the Tractatus, including religion and his fear, death, and so on and so forth. And finally, there are sentences taken from the Tractatus, including their numbers, that are written across the screen. This film has a distinctly elegiac quality. The home videos are from another world, remnants of a world destroyed by 2 world wars, the Cold War, everything else that happened in the 20th century. By embedding the Tractatus within these images, I think, Forgách very deliberately places it in a remote time and place, the philosophical equivalent, perhaps, of old home videos. This, I think, historical distancing helps us highlight the extent to which the Tractatus perhaps sought to eliminate history, along with contingency, confusion, and crisis. A utopian project that failed. In 1986, Jan Zwicky, whom I mentioned, entitled his Wittgensteinian poem Wittgenstein Elegies. A few years later, Forgách creates this very powerful elegy for Wittgenstein. These 6 years from 1986 to 92 saw this unprecedented flowering of Wittgenstein literature, in particular these poetic responses, flowering tinged with the sense of elegy. So let me just conclude by, and I hope we'll manage to do this, with just a few minutes from this powerful film. So let's see how we can start this. Very good. And I hope we'll have sound as well. Okay, we don't seem to have sound. Do we need to switch the sound?
Yeah.
Okay. Bad. I think we probably know. I'm concerned that the sound doesn't work, but I don't know how.
I didn't know you needed sound.
Their sound was here earlier, though. Maybe try to. Their sound? I don't think so. It doesn't matter. I'll just show the images. So the sound is powerful.
There's sound?
It's not on. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
As we